God bless you, my brothers and sisters. We are continuing today in our 40 Days of Decrease series. Today we are fasting from intimidation. I want to commend you to read through the scriptures for today found in John chapter 19, verses 7 through 16. And then let's jump right into our devotional for today. Intimidation works by shrinking the horizon. It narrows our vision until fear feels more real than truth, until perceived threat outweighs our conviction. When intimidation succeeds, it does not need to persuade us that something is wrong. It only needs to convince us that obedience is too costly. Lent brings this tactic into the light, and it asks whether fear has quietly begun to rule where faith once stood. Today invites us to confront intimidation, not as physical violence alone, but as the pressure that coerces compromise and silences truth. Intimidation is the use of fear to influence decisions or behavior or allegiance. Spiritually, intimidation thrives when authority, threats, or consequences are amplified, when they override the conscience. It doesn't require force. Suggestion alone is often enough. To fast from intimidation is not to deny danger or to pretend that fear doesn't exist. It is to refuse allowing fear to dictate allegiance. This fast trains us to recognize coercion and to anchor obedience in truth rather than in threat. John records that the Jewish leaders told Pilate in chapter 19, verse 7, "We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he made himself God, or made himself rather the Son of God." His accusation alters the atmosphere. John then notes in verse 8, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. Fear enters explicitly into the narrative. Pilate questions Jesus in verse 9, asking, "Where are you from? Where are you from?" But Jesus doesn't answer him. And his silence further unsettles Pilate, who responds by asserting his authority in verse 10. "Do you not know that I have the authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus responds in verse 11 with clarity rather than submission. That's what Pilate was looking for, was submission. Jesus responds with clarity. "You have no authority over me at all, unless it had been given you from above." Jesus is refusing intimidation, placing power in proper perspective. Authority exists, but it's not ultimate. From this point, Pilate seeks to release Jesus. And in verse 12, the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you're not Caesar's friend." This is intimidation's decisive move. The threat of political consequence and loss of status is this heightened sense of intimidation, where now Pilate, who was trying to intimidate Jesus, becomes the one intimidated by the people. The pressure succeeds, and in verse 16, he delivers Jesus to be crucified. Intimidation thrives where fear of loss eclipses fear of God. Pilate is not unconvinced of Jesus' innocence, but he's overcome by the cost of integrity. Intimidation reframes obedience as recklessness and compromise as prudence. Jesus is unmoved. He acknowledges authority, but he's not bowing to it. His freedom is internal. It's grounded in truth that cannot be threatened away. And this contrast exposes the difference between positional power and moral authority. Intimidation gains power when fear governs allegiance. That's the heart of today. Intimidation gains power when fear governs allegiance. Freedom is preserved when truth remains the reference point. Pilate possessed authority, but he lacked courage. Jesus possessed neither position nor protection, but he stands not intimidated because his allegiance was settled. I want you to think for a moment, though, even about the reality that Pilate is in the position that he's in, and God uses his natural insecurities, his natural instability in his position to bring about his ultimate purpose. So don't let the storyline shift you away from the reality that in all of this, God is still the one who's behind the scenes pulling strings. Lent strengthens spiritual resistance. By fasting intimidation, we learn to identify the voices that leverage fear to shape our decisions. This discipline trains us to pause before yielding and to ask whether obedience is being displaced by self preservation. Fasting from intimidation doesn't eliminate fear, it just prevents fear from becoming the sovereign. And so today's fast invites awareness. You have to notice where pressure influences your choices: fear of rejection, loss, conflict, consequence. And then ask whose approval has been allowed to outweigh your obedience to God. Is it the approval of a loved one? Is it the approval of an employer? Whose approval are you allowing to outweigh your obedience to God? And then choose one moment today to act without being driven by fear. Speak truth carefully, refuse compromise quietly, and let conviction guide response rather than intimidation. Here are your questions for reflection before you pray today. Where has fear recently shaped my decisions? What threats, real or implied, most influence my obedience? And how does remembering God's authority reshape my courage? Again, I want to commend you to read through the scriptures for today. That's John chapter 19, verses 7 through 16, to think through these reflection questions and then take the time to pray today as we continue on this Lenten journey. God bless you, my brothers and sisters, and we'll see you on the next day of Lent.